Hi, my name is Kevin Thomas, W1DED. Today I have with me Kenny Silverman, K2KW. I first met Kenny via email while I was in Virgin Gorda last year, and he was getting in touch with me asking what 10-meter propagation was like in preparation for his own effort to come down to the British Virgin Islands to operate the ARRL 10-meter contest. Since then, as I usually do, I've spent a lot of time looking at his QRZ page and kind of digging into his background. And Kenny has certainly done a lot of portable operations from multiple countries very competitively. He's formed a group called the Team Vertical, and his particular specialty is vertical antenna setup in these locations. So I'm really excited to talk to Kenny today so I can learn more about his Team Vertical. Kenny, thanks for joining me.
Oh, great. Nice to be with you, Kevin, and I appreciate the invitation.
Before we get into Team Vertical, I'd like to start from where you began. When did you get your ham radio license, and what did that process look like for you?
Well, interestingly, I got on the air before I got my license. This is back in early high school days. I think I was 13 years old. I was at summer camp, and they had a ham radio operator, a retired guy, come in, W3 Fine Business Friend, FBF. And that's where I got introduced to ham radio. Picked up Morse code really quickly. The technical part was a little bit hard for me back then. So one of the other friends let me use his sister's license. So I signed Lisa on CW on an old Gonset radio. And I guess the rest is history. That I really love CW. Ham radio has been a part of me for 40 years now. I love traveling. I love going to other cultures. So that's really kind of what drew me overseas. And
I love that story. In fact, I started operating without a license also. I was using my dad's call sign, WA1YOA, while I was awaiting my license to arrive. I'll never forget one of the local hams kind of found me out because he realized my fist, my CW, sounded different than my father's, and he knew that it was me. But it was kind of a fun process to get started early, and then I was originally licensed as WB1DED, but that's my story. We're here to talk about you. I'm really curious how your start in ham radio actually became something that was very competitive with contesting. When did that happen for you?
I've always, like I said, I've always enjoyed CW, and I think it was just the early QSL cards that I got. I think the first one from Japan was JH1WIX, and I started seeing all these different countries and QSL cards, and I just got really interested in what it would be like to visit other countries, and I think that that drove me to pursue both work opportunities and as well as ham radio opportunities to travel overseas. I first started going down to Victor Papa 5, Turks and Caicos Islands, and I got invited there by a gentleman who apparently we used to talk on the radio all the time as teenagers. Later in life, he said, "Why don't you come and join this expedition?" Turns out that we had known each other for a long time, and that was for a contest. I learned very quickly that at that time, I didn't have the experience to operate well in a competitive operation, and I just started to continue to get on for contesting. And I think the first real competitive operation that I started going overseas was down to Jamaica, 6 Yankee. It was back in 1998. The original thought was we went down for an ARRL DXCW contest. I had gotten together a bunch of very talented other hams. We came in first on that contest, and that's kind of where also verticals on the beach started. But more in contesting, it was just going out and operating. A lot of people will ask, what's your trick? And there really isn't any trick. It is just experience on the air. And so when we were down in 6Y, we had horizontal antennas, which were, at the time, conventional wisdom said we should have a high takeoff angle from Jamaica into the States. So we had horizontal antennas, small Yagis on 10, 15, and 20. Also on 20, we decided to put up a 2-element vertical. And then on 40, 80, and 160, we also had verticals. Well, 20 meters really showed us that the takeoff angles into the States really were not these high angles that people were showing. And typically, compared to a 2-element wire Yagi at about 40, 45 feet versus the 2-element quarter-wave vertical right by the ocean, the vertical was always a couple S units more. Sometimes the difference was 9 S units. And that really just surprised us. And that was into the States. And when you start taking a look at the takeoff angles, what's needed to get a really low one hop, that's where the takeoff angles of verticals over saltwater really show. And the next year is when Team Vertical, I guess, really was born because we transferred over to all vertical antennas. And that's when we set the world record for multi-multi in the CQ Worldwide CW contest. And that kind of, I think, sent some shockwaves around the contesting world because other groups have always used horizontal antennas, and they see us, and we could actually hold all of the antennas we had, all the vertical antennas, weighed maybe about 70 pounds at that point. It was kind of a smaller operation. One person could hold all of the antennas, and we set the world record in the multi-multi category. So ever since then, I've been using verticals on the beach, and the reason why is, let's say you put up a 2-element vertical. It has the same peak gain as a Yagi antenna would have, but it's got the takeoff angle all the way down to the horizon. And it's those low takeoff angles which are important, especially if you are trying to reach very long distances. A lot of the expeditions out into the Pacific Ocean, where every path is thousands and thousands of kilometers away, you really need takeoff angles below 10 degrees. And these simple verticals really just do a fantastic job. And on a typical trip, you just can't get a horizontal antenna high enough to capture those low angles.
Well, Kenny, one of the things I appreciate about what you're saying is that experience played a big role in improvement over time. And I'm just looking at your QRZ page here, and I need to read this off. You've operated from XE, C6, 6Y, KP5, VP5 4 times, YV 12 times, ON, PA, CT. The list goes on. This is incredible. How did you possibly manage to get so many DX trips in over the years, and what did you see as a progression during that time? How did your equipment change? I suspect, even though you landed upon verticals early, that process probably changed over time. But also, what were you using for other gear, and how did that evolve over time?
Yes, every time you go on a trip, you will learn something new. And you try to incorporate that going forward. And it's just direct experience. For example, when taking luggage overseas, we used to pack our radios in a suitcase, wrap clothes around them, which a lot of people think would be really good padding. But on one trip out to Fiji, when radio was, I guess the suitcase was dropped, the front panel was smashed, and we had to really do a kludged setup to use that radio in the field. So we learned not to use clothing to wrap things and to always hand carry all of our equipment. Anything that you want to arrive there on time with you and not damaged, you try to carry on. And that will change your radios a little bit. If you're going solo, any radio, small radio, will be fine, especially as you're starting off doing trips like this. And as you gain experience, you might realize that you want a better receiver and a radio, so you might upgrade. I mean, one of the radios right now, it's been out for, 20 years, is the Elecraft K3, which you can actually find those used fairly easily and at a reasonable price. Really were one of the first great receivers in a radio for doing pileup running when you're on the DX side. But from a trip standpoint, I guess my first trip overseas for ham radio was to VP5. I was then invited down to X-Ray Echo for VHF opportunity. And I just decided I wanted to go on trips. At that time, I was single. So I could usually get one trip in a year. Then after that, after a while, I got addicted to operating on the other side of a pileup. And I would go often 2 times a year. So when you go 2 times a year, and over 40 years, you start racking up trips. Then, of course, I got married, and that turned off the contest expeditions for a while. But now that the kids are grown up, and I can go out and take trips now.
Yeah, one of the things you said earlier was that there was not really a trick to your success, and maybe it's not a trick, but one of the things I learned from talking to you was being highly selective as to the location that you're going to. And speaking from my own personal experience, I've always balanced these trips down to St. Vincent, for example, or in Virgin Gorda, with my wife's vacationing expectation, and I would often end up on the south side of an island. And I know in talking to you, I mean, that was absolutely one of the first things you notice. You're on the wrong side of the island. You don't have a good takeoff angle. So get into that for me a little bit. I mean, you don't
Sure.
just get on a plane and take a trip to the Bahamas. You do a lot of research to determine where that best location is. So talk to me about that.
As you mentioned, really the purpose of your trip is going to have a great impact on what kind of location you're going to operate from. When you're with your wife, you probably have to put a balance between having a nice time with your wife versus getting on the radio. So sometimes the wife wins, sometimes the radio wins, sometimes you can find a nice balance. But when you go down as a radio operator, typically you want to experience pileups, especially as you're getting started. And once you become a more competitive person, pileups are everything. But when you start out, it's doing the research on where the location is. Typically, you want to be on the north side of an island, or maybe you're on a hill on some country, but you still want to make sure that you've got a good path to US, Europe, and hopefully Japan, where that's where the bulk of the contacts come from. So it's that selection of a location which really brings a lot of success to your operations. Finding that location can be tough. There are rent-a-QTHs out there, as I call them. At one point when I was single, I had a website called DX Holiday, where I was collecting information on where people can operate or what are ham-friendly locations. Unfortunately, I can no longer maintain that, so that's fallen away. But there are still people that advertise their locations for you to operate from, which if you're going down solo and you want to do ham radio only, those are great opportunities. You don't bring anything other than headphones and a bathing suit, and you can get on the air very easily. And for someone starting out, those may just be the right things to do. As you start doing and bringing all your own equipment, again, that's where some of the learning process comes in. But getting back to finding the location, my main two sources that I go to for locations are VRBO and Airbnb. Those are two websites where there are locations, predominantly villas or houses, that you can rent. The type of venue which you go to also can have an impact on what type of antennas you can bring. If you go to a resort, for example, and you're going with your wife, you may be very limited to a small antenna and maybe not in the best place to take advantage of the location. You'll get on, you'll make lots of contacts, you have fun, especially as you're starting out. Though I've always gone towards these rental houses for two reasons. One is you generally can do almost anything you want to on those properties. Of course, I tell the person, this is what we're doing. We've done this before. We'll leave your location in as good or better condition than when we got there. We reassure them about our intentions, and usually you can just do whatever you want to. You can put up lots of antennas. Smaller hotels also are often good places that when it's a smaller place, they're more likely to let you set up some antennas rather than going to some big beach resort. I also tend to try to find places, and as we've talked, I like to go to beachfront locations. I try to find locations that doesn't have a whole lot of beach traffic. When people walk by and they're tripping over antennas, or you're blocking the beach so they can't walk by, it's really something that you have to be very cognizant of being a good steward of in amateur radio. And when you go to someone else's house, you want to not infringe on anything that you really shouldn't. So finding locations like that can be a little tough if you're looking on the beachfront. On the other hand, when we first talked, you were down on an island, and you can often find a really lovely home to rent, or a small hotel or something where they'll say, sure, set up your antennas, and you set them up, but you've got a great location, and you get the best of both worlds of a great ham radio location as well as spending time with your wife.
I think you're going to add a lot of value to listeners, and I wish that I'd met you 2 years ago, because as you go through that list, I've made all those mistakes over the last couple of years. I started traveling to, I think my first St. Vincent trip was to a hotel. I got the approval, but there's two things I didn't take into consideration. One is how obnoxious it was going to be to the other guests to have an antenna on the front lawn in front of the hotel. And also, we had significant interference, so that didn't work out well. My return trip to St. Vincent involved a golf cart and traveling way too far, setting up portably every single day, which in the heat ended up not being as much fun as it could have been. So again, I've been through a lot of those errors, but so thank you for that perspective. I think I'd like to jump ahead to when you and I met via email back in, I think it was late 2023, and you were planning a trip to the British Virgin Islands to operate the ARRL 10-meter contest. And I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the name of the island, so I'll let you do that. But let's get specific about that particular trip, how you researched that location and what you planned for gear and how it all turned out for you.
Let's first talk about the criteria that I was looking to achieve for the ARRL 10-meter contest. Specifically as 10-meter, looking at propagation, I do a lot of analysis in an online tool called VOACAP, VOACAP, and it's a free propagation analysis program. And now that 10 meters was in, we're near the top of the cycle, I wanted to experience that contest, which I really hadn't competed in competitively. So Again, when you're contesting, you really need a good location to work Europe, United States, and Japan. That's where the bulk of your QSOs are going to come from. You also need a location where you can get the multipliers. And using verticals on the beach, you obviously want to go to a beachfront location. Now, I also wanted at that time a really safe and relaxing place. I think as I've matured, I go to less challenging locations. So we decided we'd want to go to the Caribbean, as we often do. And I wanted to make sure that I could point an antenna to the south to get South America and long path propagation on 10 meters into Asia. Well, on many of the islands in the Caribbean, if you get a hillside location, you might have a great takeoff angle to where the main running population is, but if you point the antenna to the south, you're pointing into a hill. So I didn't want that. I wanted to point over flat land. So that really eliminated a lot of the islands in the Caribbean. I really needed to go to a flat island. And interestingly, there aren't a lot of flat islands in the Caribbean. One of them, which I think would do well, is Anegada. I apologize. Anegada would be a good flat island. There's a couple of islands off the coast of Mexico, which are touristy. There's maybe an island or two down in Honduras. But that was, I think, a little bit outside of my comfort zone at this point for traveling. So I just created this big list, which got narrowed down very quickly, of potential locations, and I ended up settling on Anegada Island. One of the other islands that I was looking at was one in St. Vincent and the Grenadines called, oh boy, I'm sorry, I'm getting my islands mixed up, but there's a little island there, which is just a flat island. But ultimately, Anegada won out. It was flat. We had a perfect beachfront location. One of the interesting things about verticals is that you want a location where the tide doesn't go in. It's not a very large tide. If the tide goes out and your antennas are now 100 feet away from the water, your antennas aren't going to perform well. So finding something like that to really maximize every possible aspect of the contest really just takes a lot of research. I want to go back to the websites that we talked about and using those for picking a location. Quite often, there will be locations which say beach view, or maybe not even say beach view, but when you look at the pictures, they show all these great pictures of beaches. Well, you have to be very careful in when you look and making sure that it's beachfront. I will often call the person and find out and talk to them directly. Just because it's got a beach picture doesn't mean it's on the beachfront. So you really, again, have to do your research in talking to the person about their location, or one of the other things you can do is to look at websites like DX Summit of where people have operated before and ask them where they operated from and get some tips from them. So the research that goes into at least a world competitive location, it takes experience and just a lot of research. I also want to bring up, in terms of the research aspect, one other tool is Google Earth. Quite often, you can either get the location or an approximate location of the house, assuming that's what you're renting, and you can then use pictures that they've put up on the website, often to key in exactly on where that location is. Sometimes people won't know. I don't know where my coordinates are. They can't, they're not that savvy to do that. You can take a picture that shows the driveway orientation. Maybe there's a solar array on top of the house. There's some unique feature which you can tie, and if you know the area you're looking at, it might take you 15, 20 minutes at worst, but sometimes it only takes a few minutes to really find out exactly where that location is. And you can then look at how much land there is if you're doing a larger operation, you are bringing down multiple antennas. So Google Earth is a really important tool in doing the research that I do also.
It's all really good stuff. And it does remind me of, again, our initial contact where you were really continuing your research. You're paying attention to the fact that I was in Virgin Gorda VP2V and checking with me to find out what the propagation was like. It also reminds me of the contrast crew that I get together with every Tuesday night. And oftentimes they are talking about doing similar things, like paying attention to logs, paying attention to recent propagation so they can maximize their efforts. And I think it's sometimes it's the easy thing in front of us that a lot of us ignore. We just get on the plane and go down and try to figure out once we're there. But let's get back to your most recent, your ARRL 10. So you've chosen location, you've used all these websites, you've chosen well. What did you decide to take with you on that trip, and who traveled with you?
This location turned out to be a fantastic location for verticals on the beach. There was actually a reef out in front of the cottage, about 1,000 feet offshore, which tempered all of the waves. So the difference between high tide and low tide was a couple of feet in terms of distance on the beach. In terms of elevation, it was about a foot difference in tide. So it was very low, very little impact. The verticals were always right by the ocean. And they were 70 feet away. So we used very high gain vertical antennas at that location. We used a 4-element fixed array on Europe, and European pileups tend to be very difficult. They call on top of each other very often. So we wanted the biggest signal we can put in, and using this 4-element array, it had the gain of a 5-element Yagi, but that gain was all the way down to the horizon. So if you were competing against someone else who had a 5-element Yagi at 50 feet, which is a fairly common antenna for people with fixed stations in either Caribbean or South America, we had the same peak gain, but we had 10 dB, if not more, advantage at takeoff angles below 5 degrees. And there are so many signals that come in at the low takeoff angles. It just really made us that much more competitive over what one would consider a fairly decent antenna for running a contest. We also had a 2-element array fixed on United States and Europe. It also covered Mexico, which is an important factor in this particular contest, that Mexico there are multipliers there, which you want to work. So you want to work as many Mexican stations as you can. Then we had a 2-element horizontal Moxon antenna up at about 30 feet for any area over land. If you have ever had the opportunity to use and compare verticals versus a horizontal antenna, you'll find it very quickly that verticals over land are kind of like verticals over land at home. They just don't work too well. That even a low 2-element Yagi is going to work better than a vertical over land. So we had 3 antennas there, and we had a little switch. It's called a stack match. You can switch any antenna in or out. Typically, we'd run on one antenna only at a time, but if you wanted to, you could split your power between, let's say, United States and South America. So you can pick up the best of both worlds. I'm sure your power gets split, but you get overall better coverage and potentially more callers, calling at the same time. We were competing in the multi-single category, and again, very competitively. And in order to do that, you need what's called a multiplier station, which is another station that is on the same band and can listen through the transmit antennas. There is no interference between the two stations. So you can work multipliers. You want the station running, the multiplier station searching for multipliers and other QSOs. So we put up yet another antenna to do that, to be able to work QSOs. Working in band is fairly difficult. You need basically physical space, as well as, if you can, antenna polarization difference, verticals versus horizontals. So that's what we had. From a radio standpoint, when you're running in a multi operation, you really want a very good receiver. As I mentioned before, the aircraft K3 is a very easy and small receiver to use. And it really doesn't cause that much interference, if any, between stations. That you can use other radios, which are known big name brand radios, which will transmit a lot of interference even on other bands. Early on in our contesting career down in Jamaica, we had gotten, I think we brought down 7 brand new Yaesu FT1001 MPs. And, they were the hottest radio out there. When we got down there, they were just causing interference left and right on other bands. They didn't handle pileup. The AGC wasn't good. That everything turned into a mush. You couldn't discern calls. So when you've got potentially hundreds of people calling you, you really just need a very good receiver, and the aircraft is one of those. The aircraft K4, we had one of those. There are some other radios out there, some Kenwood radios, which people contest with, which are also good to bring down. So we brought everything with us. We brought the coax, we brought the antennas. Logistics becomes an important thing. In terms of who brings what, making sure that you've got a list and everything's checked off. That we weren't, we were on this remote little island. There was no other potential to, get anything on the island in terms of electronics other than maybe wire. You get an electrical cord and split that and make an antenna out of it if you needed to. So you really need to bring everything. You need to often bring spares. Again, if you want to be competitive, you have to make sure that if you have a failure, and it really isn't it's really, over time it becomes when you have a failure, you need another power supply, you need another radio, you need another piece of critical equipment. So to bring down this station, we needed 4 people. And we really wanted to be competitive. We were actually having 3 stations on the air at once. It wasn't just 2. It wasn't just the run in the multiplier station. We had another pair of ears listening. Excuse me, Kevin, I think this is going to be an audit.
So, Kenny, one of the things that I'd like to get into is licensing. Obviously, when you're traveling like you have to multiple countries, you've dealt with a lot of licensing issues. Can you get into that a little bit and what your experience has been and what somebody else could expect if they were doing the same?
My experience obviously is coming from someone in the United States, so there may be some differences coming from a European country or from somewhere else in the world. But for United States hams, for getting a license overseas, there's basically 3 different ways you can do it. One is the reciprocal license. That is where there's an agreement between the United States and the entity or country that you're going to. And that's always my favorite. The other is what's known as the IARP, which is an agreement between United States and most South American countries where technically you can go to ARRL and you can look up IARP, International Amateur Radio Permit, and the details will be there. And theoretically, all you have to do is print that out. The other option is if you're going to, from the United States to Europe, you can get what's known as a CEPT, and that allows a U.S. ham to operate in most of the European countries without a specific license. That said, while both of those should work, through my experience, I still prefer to go and get a reciprocal, even if I can operate under the IARP or CEPT, just because I will have paperwork from an entity of that country. Typically it's a licensing authority in that country. It'll have, letterhead on it, which customs or whomever else you need to show it to as you're entering the country. It's something that they know was authorized by their country. So that's really why I like to go for the reciprocal. Also for the IARP and CEPT, and also for most reciprocal, it's going to be, the call sign will be country prefix / your call sign. So I'm going back down to British Virgin Islands, which is VP2V. The call sign there would be VP2V portable K2KW. And again, that's standard for all the IARP, CEPT, and reciprocal. Though, if you go with you do the reciprocal application, often you can request a special call sign for a special event, such as a contest. Sometimes they'll authorize it just for the duration of your stay. It really varies between countries. But for VP2V, I was able to get a VP2V Mike, VP2V because of the long call prefix of VP2V, it's a very long call sign. A lot of times you can go and get other countries that I've been to, let's say Victor Papa 5. You can often get a special 2x1 VP2V-Z or something like that. So sometimes you can get very short calls. Sometimes you might get a 2x3 call like I have for VP2V. Other times they may just say no, you just have to operate with the call sign of the country / yours. Sometimes it's actually K2KW / 6Y5 is the way Jamaica authorizes permission for operation. But again, for Jamaica, I was able to get special call signs for 6Y4A, 6Y2A, and so forth. So do your homework very, as far ahead as you can. Typically, 2-3 months is the minimum that I would suggest you apply for reciprocal licensing. Sometimes countries take even longer. When you submit for the licensing, typically you'll be asked for a passport, copy of your license, where you're staying, contact information, and so forth. So for the most part, it's pretty easy. I'd like to also talk about, getting a license may be very easy. Sometimes getting equipment into that country is not. And that, I think you really have to just ask around. From all of my travels, one of the more difficult ones has actually been Jamaica. For a while, when I first started going there, I was able to talk my way through, saying, yes, I'm just bringing this equipment in, and I go through the customs line. I have nothing to declare because it's my personal equipment is coming back. But now they really require often to have a bond put down so they know that you're going to be returning, leaving the country with the equipment that you've gone in with. Another one that is fairly well known is for 9 Yankee for Trinidad and Tobago. They absolutely require you to have and actually work with a local bond and shipping company in that country to bring your ham radio equipment in. So it's going to vary. You might want to talk around. A lot of times I've asked the licensing authority for if they know about any information about bringing an equipment in. A lot of times they do not. Sometimes I've asked for them to put my equipment on the license. For example, I might bring in, I'm an Elecraft person, so I'll bring an Elecraft K3 with that serial number. And anything that might have a serial number, you put down on it. Again, it's a way to show what you're bringing in, and then you can show that you're bringing it on your way out. There's unfortunately a lot of variance. I would look up people whom have gone to those entities. You can look up on DX Summit on past expeditions, or just people that you can pretty much tell that they've operated from the country. So it might be VP2V Portable W1ABC or VP2V slash W1DED. Those people will give you a lot of information about what might be the issues about getting equipment into the country. A lot of times, especially in the Caribbean, if you're starting out in your first countries, going to the Caribbean, it's pretty easy, except for those countries which I talked about. So that's really kind of an overview of licensing and equipment. Is there anything else that you can think of that we might need to address, Kevin?
There is. I just want to, before we move on, though, attest to the benefit of having that license with you when you're entering a country. When I traveled to St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the Bahamas, British Virgin Islands, I had that license. And interestingly, in all 3 cases, when I tried to pass through customs going into the country, it wasn't until I pulled that license out that they got a little more relaxed. So I totally agree with that. It seems official, and it certainly helped, particularly in St. Vincent. And also, I'm planning a trip to Turks and Caicos next year. Also took some of your advice and reached out to a ham radio operator that operates regularly from Turks, and he made me aware of the bond and the fact that you want to be really careful because you want to make sure you have enough time when you're getting back on that flight to get all the paperwork taken care of, which absolutely changed the way that I planned on operating. The question I want to come to, beyond asking people, is there any central location, Kenny, that people can go to? I mean, there are a lot of people like yourself out there doing DXpeditions. Is there a central website that contains how to maneuver the St. Vincent process or the Trinidad and Tobago process?
Well, the most thorough database that I know about is actually with the ARRL. You can type in international operating. It will lead you to a host of information, talking about the licensing that we were just discussing, as well as they typically have information on many countries. People such as myself or you or other people that have gone will write in, and they've archived information on tips, people to contact, and so forth. In addition, in the ARRL database, they will have the information of the National Amateur Radio Club or organization, and often you can go to them to find out information on licensing again, and especially bringing in equipment. But all of the information that I I start out with is in the ARRL. The database that they have actually, they incorporated data from someone else that was doing this private. I think was it OH2 MCN? I don't know. I think it was some OH2 had collected a lot of information. So some of it's there, some of it's old, but really that's the best starting place. And if the information is not up to date from the personal side of things, always go to the national organization and they can help you.
So since we're talking about getting equipment into a foreign country, I'm curious about your experience with checking equipment, putting your Pelican case into the luggage hold versus carry-on versus shipping it ahead of time, just sending it via shipper to your location. What have you done and what would you recommend?
I've always hand carried things, just because I'm always concerned about damage along the way. In terms of getting equipment like shipping overseas, I haven't done that. It's possible. You probably, and all of the listeners here are probably familiar with major expeditions that go out and they will ship the equipment ahead of time, or some of the equipment ahead of time, especially things that like coax and antennas and sometimes radios and especially amplifiers, just due to the weight issues that are involved. So I haven't had any direct experience with that, but often countries will have importer-exporters that you can deal with to ship your equipment that way. But in terms of just general traveling to a Caribbean island, I've always hand carried as much of the equipment as possible, and I prioritize equipment for the radio and the computer. If you have to pack something into your hand carry, I limit the least value equipment in there. Sometimes you just still have to pack a radio in there. For a long time, I had actually used the packing foam that comes with the box, assuming you have the original box and the original foam that it was shipped with. I use that. The negative side about that is it takes up a lot of extra space. The positive side is that it's molded to your equipment and is very good. The other thing you can do is actually take your equipment to a shipping organization. I don't know if UPS might do it, but there's often very local shipping companies that will can actually spray foam into an area, or if you want to do, let's say, just a single radio for a small piece of luggage, you bring the piece of luggage, you bring the radio, and they'll put some plastic over the radio, and then they'll spray foam in there. So you now have a very safe way of transporting the equipment. If you wrap it in your equipment in a checked piece of luggage, you wrap it in clothes. We've gone through that, and very high chance of damage of the equipment. So I tend to err on the side of safety and go for packing and your own foam inserts when you can. If you go on your trip and you've gone through all this planning, you've gone through all this expense, you go to an island or a country where you can't get anything spare, making sure that it's all shipped there safely is really a very important step, just to make sure that everything gets there safely and on time. And that's the other reason why I also like to hand carry rather than shipping. for the most part, it comes with you. If a bag gets lost on the way, which happens occasionally, it might just be a day or two before you get it. If you ship it ahead of time, again, I'm not familiar enough with the processes, but you probably need to ship it way ahead of time, months, just to make sure that it gets there safely and on time again.
Kenny, I really appreciate your insight for all of us on how best to plan and execute a solo DXpedition, either for contesting or just for operating, and to do so in a competitive fashion. That's much appreciated. I take it your next trip is to the British Virgin Islands based upon comment a minute ago?
I'm going back to the British Virgin Islands in December of this year. Same competition for ARRL, 10-meter contest. It's really at the top of the cycle. It's going to be much better. Well, we went there last year, where unfortunately the days we were there, the conditions were not very good. But right now, the solar flux and the sunspot number has been much higher than expected. So we want to go back there. We're hoping to break the low power multi-single record that we made last year, that we think that there's a lot more to go. But yes, going back there in December. I don't have any specific plans after that, though my wife and I have been talking about going to Iceland to see the Northern Lights. Of course, if I do that, it won't be with equipment, though I've also been looking at some other islands more in the southern hemisphere, again for the ARRL 10-meter contest in 2025. So those are my immediate plans and something possibly coming up in the future. One thing which I didn't address, it's ticketing where you generally want to go through the website of the airline rather than going through a third party. That's in case you have to change reservations. It's often easier to change them directly with the airline than it is with with the third-party website. The other aspect is also, if possible, trying to always be on the same airline all the way through. Sometimes you can't do that. And the issue is actually the extra cost you pay for baggage. If you fly through on the same airline, you pay the baggage fee once. If you have to fly from one carrier and you transfer to another carrier on your traveling, you often have to pay for that luggage twice. So those are two other important things.
Kenny, that's a really good point. And I can attest to my own experience going to the Bahamas, where I wasn't expecting to pay as much as I did on the smaller flight to Eleuthera. But worse, I didn't realize there was going to be a different weight limit on my luggage from the main carrier to the small puddle jumper over to the island, and it created some commotion in the airport trying to get things moved around, because I was traveling with antenna equipment and tuners and such in my checked luggage. So excellent point, and I appreciate you bringing that up. My name is Kevin Thomas, W1DED. I've been talking to Kenny Silverman, K2KW. You'll hear him on the ARRL 10 as VP2MM. Thank you for your advice.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you, Kevin. And you've been doing great content, and I've been enjoying it.